Hello, my name is Klaus Vistisen. This is a video for all the Leasehold campaigners on Twitter that I've interacted with over the last couple of months. I think we are about to start a campaign, me and some other people, for the reform of Leasehold. So I thought I'd do a little bit introductory video about who I am and how I think about this topic, which I know is so important for a lot of people. It's important for me as well. I'm a leaseholder myself, but I think it's fair to say that the kind of issues I'm dealing with at the moment as a leaseholder, touch wood, are sort of very low key compared to some of the nightmarish situation other leaseholders find themselves in. So in this brief video, I'm basically going to do three things. I'm going to explain what leasehold is, the way I see it in terms of sort of framing that in the context of the campaign. And then I'm going to explain what the problems with leaseholds are. And then I'm going to explain how to fix it. So, no pressure then. Anyway, what is leasehold? For the purpose of this discussion here, and I think for the purpose of most discussions, we can think about leasehold as a way to own and acquire property. But obviously, in reality, when you're a leaseholder, you don't really own the property. What you own is the right to live in a dwelling, usually a flat, but it could be a house as well. And that right then extends usually over a very long period of time. Some modern leases can be 250 years or even 1999 years. Some leases are shorter at 125, 100 years, but they're all generally above 100 years. If they get below 100 years, they start to sort of slowly become something different. But long leases in general give you the right to live in a dwelling for an extended period of time. A lot of people who watch this will already know this, but I think it's important to just say that outright to begin with. Then the relationship between the leaseholder, who owns the flat, for example, and the freeholder, who owns the building and the land on which the flat essentially sits as part of the building. The relationship between these parties is then governed by the lease, the agreement, right? And this effectively, if you think about it, is a fairly trivial document, right? It's a document that's a contract, if you will, that describes the conditions under which I have to pay for the maintenance of the building that my flat resides in. And it also then sets out the responsibilities of the freeholder in terms of what he or she has to do as I pay my so-called service charge. And in reality, it should be fairly trivial. But as most people know, it's anything but trivial. But again, these two aspects of leasehold, the fact that it's not really property ownership, it's a right to live in a property for a period of time, provided that you pay your upkeep, as it were, your service charge and your ground rent. I'll come back to ground rent, but again, you pay service charge and you pay ground rent. And then, that's basically how you then govern the fact that you are, in this case, a flat owner, and as long as you pay your service charge and your ground rent, everything is fine, right? You can live in your flat, you can use the land on which the flat sits. The big difference in the context of the relationship between the freehold and leasehold, though, which I think is important to mention here, is of course the legal requirement of the leaseholder to keep paying ground rent and service charges, especially if they are, in the context of service charges, reasonably obtained or reasonably demanded, on the threat of forfeiture, right? So freeholders have a very draconian right that gives them effectively the right to forfeit your flat or take your flat away if you don't pay your service charge or ground rent. So that is what leasehold is a right to live in a dwelling for an extended period of time, provided that you pay your service charge and your ground rent. So what's the problem with this? Well, I mean, a lot of the people watching this don't need me to tell them, but I think it's important as we move forward and as we try to bring other people in line with our views and try to bring to the attention of other people, the problems of leasehold. I think it's important to try to spell out what the main problems are. And in reality, there are two overarching issues with this system. More specifically, there are two sort of buckets in which most challenges, be they very, very severe or minor, go into, right? You've basically got the risk of potentially uncontrollable service charges. And uncontrollable here is the key, because really what a leasehold is in the worst situation is a complete loss of control over your finances, your home, because it is very difficult for leaseholders to, in a lot of cases, to control how much they pay, what they're paying for, and the services that they're getting. And it's also very difficult for leaseholders in the context of which they're not getting the service they're paying for, or they're being sort of shortchanged, if you will, or badly treated, quite frankly, by the freeholder, to actually hold the freehold to account. Even though, in theory, and if you look at sort of by the letter of the law, the lease kind of says what the freehold is supposed to do, and if the freehold doesn't do it, there are recourse, that there should be recourse in the law and in the courts to kind of get the freeholder to get in line, but that is obviously in practice very difficult, and in most cases completely impossible. So this risk of completely escalating uncontrollable service charges, which basically renders people financial prisoners in their own home, is something. It's an aspect of leasehold that is, I think, now coming to the fore. The two most grotesque examples of this, obviously, are the building safety crisis in one context, and then as a kind of derivative of that, the insurance scam crisis, where before the Building Safety Act, which has shifted the liability a little bit from leaseholders over to freeholders in terms of who's paying for fire safety defects, freeholders could simply just send a bill to leaseholders for several £100,000, and if they don't pay, you know what, you forfeit. And as this goes on, of course, you can't mortgage your flat, you can't sell your flat, and all you can do is pay the service charge if you can. If you can't, you can lose your home, right? So which basically puts people up against the wall, and there's no way out. Again, as a complete and sole function of this contract that you've entered with your freeholder, which is the lease, which basically stipulates that if you don't pay your service charge at whatever demand really that the freeholder stipulates, you can lose your home. The insurance commission scam, which is partly related to the fire safety crisis, I think is important to mention as well, because it's quite often this insurance payment that has to be paid, because if the building your flat is in is not insured, you can't get a mortgage on it. And it's quite often we hear stories that it's exactly this insurance payment which basically tips people over, right? So you have a service charge, the service charge might be high in its own right, and then you get that insurance bill, and we hear stories that it can go up by 5 or 10 times a year, and suddenly that can completely push you over the edge in terms of personal finances. And again, because of the wonders of the leasehold system, leaseholders have no recourse to challenge the insurance. They can't go out and try to find their own insurance in the market because they don't own the building. They just have to pay. If they don't pay, again, the freeholder can take their home away from them. So again, basically, this loss of control, which arises from the ability of the freeholder to lumber leaseholders with all kinds of costs and service charges, without making it very, very difficult for leaseholders to challenge that, or indeed to know what they're paid for, right? So there's an asymmetry here between the leaseholder and the freeholder, which as we're seeing across the country at the moment, across the UK, is bringing misery to so many leaseholders. There's also here, I think, which is fair to say, a conflict of interest between a freeholder, which is often a rent-seeking limited liability company, often offshore company, not really in itself interested in keeping the building in good working order, apart from the fact that it's supposed to do so according to the lease. Whereas, of course, the leaseholder has a distinct interest in keeping the building in good working order, because the value of the leaseholder's interest in the building, in this case the flat, obviously depends significantly on the building, right? I can keep my flat here in complete pristine condition, but if the building is falling down because the freeholder's not taking care of it, even as I'm paying my service charge, of course the value of my flat will fall, right? So there's again a huge conflict of interest there, because in many cases the freeholder simply doesn't have a good interest, a good incentive to help keep the value keep the building in working order, which would then keep the value of the leases and the flats high as well. There's simply a conflict of interest here, and it again is very difficult for the leaseholder to challenge any of this, right? And again, this is because of the way the system is set up. Another problem, just to finish, is of course that because of the things that I've mentioned here, and I do think this is a problem that has to be said out loud and made explicit, because sometimes if we say the easy things out loud, that I think is a good way to maybe bring attention to the problem. Is that, quite frankly, no one likes leasehold, right? Generally, leaseholders are not quite happy with the way that their leasehold contract works, and the way that the daily management of their building works, right? They have this low level of stress and anxiety because they don't really control. As I said before, they don't really control their personal finances. They don't know really what's going on. They don't know whether the service charge they're paying is actually going to the maintenance of the building, and how much the freeholder is kind of siphoning off on the sides. Very difficult, right? So leaseholders, to a large extent, and I'm not saying that this applies for all leaseholders, but I think we have enough evidence to suggest that leaseholders who actually like living in a flat, they like the flats maybe, but they don't like leasehold, right? There's a huge amount of problem with them. And I think that, just this simple fact that leaseholders up and down the country simply does not like this tenure, and actually feel that it's a huge burden across on their finances and also their mental health in some cases, that is enough to suggest that we should do something. It follows from that, of course, that no one else likes leasehold, right? Which is this fantastic thing that nobody really talks about, right? Because oftentimes when leasehold campaigners point out that there are problems with leasehold, one of the things that we're told is that, we're just a sort of a vocal minority, that leasehold works quite well, that actually there's no problem at all. It's just, a few disgruntled leaseholders who are just moaning and moaning in an environment where most people are happy. Well, this the way to challenge that assumption and comment is that most of the people who say this, they wouldn't be caught dead with a leasehold. They wouldn't want to live in a leasehold flat, and the reason is not because they don't like to live in a flat per se. It's because they don't, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's because they don't like leasehold, right? So nobody likes leasehold. That, I mean, just to keep it on a very basic level, is a good reason to fix the system, right? Because it's a system that the people for whom it's supposed to benefit don't really like. And because people in general don't like leasehold, we also now have a situation where flats in general are now pretty much shunned. Nobody really wants them, at least to a much higher extent, I think, that it's than is being talked about in general. And my hypothesis is that the reason people don't like flats is mainly because it's leasehold. It's mainly because they know that they might like the flat, but if they buy the flat, they can't control the service charges. They don't know really what's going on, and that's a huge risk they don't want to take on, even though they might like the flat and the location. And again, that creates a huge stumbling block. Finally, I also think we have to mention the ground rent issues, in particular because how that relates to the sort of the final bit in terms of how to fix leasehold. Ground rent is a simpler payment, if you will, that you make to your freeholder. It's usually a nominal value that you pay for the privilege of being able to use the land that the freeholder, of course, still owns. And quite often the ground rent has some kind of escalation clause within it, which means that it increases over time, either via as it adjusts to inflation, or in some cases it doubles. There has been a huge amount of controversy about ground rents, especially doubling ground rents, and in particular the service, the use of ground rents in general, which is which is basically the equivalent of the purest kind of rent-seeking asset class, right? That you buy an income stream from the land on which there's already buildings, and you don't provide any service for it. You just get an income stream from people who live there, and for people who even maintain the buildings, right? So that's obviously I would say a very politically incorrect asset class, but it still exists. Now the problem with ground rents, alongside the issue of uncontrollable service charges, is that in some cases ground rents become onerous. Ground rents become onerous for two reasons, mainly. The one that people will be most aware of, I think, is this shift in the way that your lease contract is seen if your ground rent increases to above £250 outside London and £1,000 in London, which means that suddenly your lease is then seen as a sort of more standard tenancy agreement, which then gives the freeholder, at least in theory, but also in practice, a much easier ability to forfeit, take back your property if you don't pay your ground rent on time, for example. And of course, in those instances, we can definitely talk about not owning your property, which then means that people will struggle to sell their flat because other people might not want to get mortgages on, might not be able to get mortgages on it, and people with these types of ground rents will not be able to remortgage with new lenders, for example. And another reason that ground rents can become onerous is if they increase to above 0.1% of the value of the property. In many cases, lenders will be unwilling to lend on the property with such a ground rent. And this is important because you will invariably now have, especially with inflation going up, the way inflation going up, you will have many ground rents where the value of the ground rent, the nominal value of the ground rent, is increasing to above 0.1%, and that means that it will be very difficult for these people to sell their flat or remortgage it. And the government is aware of this, right? The government is aware of this. And so what the government has done is that in the middle of last year, I think it was the middle of last year, they changed the rules so that all loan leases, and new loan leases, but also extensions granted after the middle of last year's are now exempt from ground rent. You can't have ground rent on these leases, which effectively means that they are peppercorn rent. So that sounds great, except that this is one of those cases where, and this I'll come back to in terms of how to fix leasehold, but this is a case where the government has effectively sold existing leaseholders down the river. Why? Well, take a development like mine. We have some flats with ground rent and some flats without ground rent because it's a new development. It was built in 2020. And obviously rates went up, so it took quite a long time for the developer to sell. So those of us who bought off plan in 2020, we have a ground rent on our property. People who bought, and especially with the help to buy in the latter part and the newer help to buy scheme, which stipulated that there can't be ground rent, they have no ground rent. So you now have a development here with ground rent and no ground rent. That means in practice, for someone like me, I will have to buy out my ground rent to ever be able to sell my flat for two reasons. First of all, because there's going to be other similar properties here with no ground rent, which means that, if I'm going to try to sell at the same time as those properties, good, fat chance. And also because invariably my ground rent will now be above 0.1% of the value of my flat due to obviously interest rates have gone up and therefore, my ground rent is now onerous. And then I know people will probably say, well, Mr. Vistisen, you are a chief economist, you probably have a good salary, you'll be able to afford it. And that's probably true. I reckon my ground rent, if I'm very lucky, which I probably won't be, but let's just say I'm very lucky, it's going to cost me £12,000 to buy out. If I'm very unlucky, and let's be honest, I probably will be very unlucky because that's how it works when you negotiate these lease extensions, I'm going to be paying £20,000 to £25,000. I can probably scrape that together because I have a good salary, I have a good job, but other people might not be able to do that. And if they can't, again, as I said, they won't be able to sell their property. Which then brings us to the final point: how do you fix leasehold? Well, I think it would be very pretentious for me to suggest that I could fix this just by a 5-minute talk on a YouTube video here. But one principle that I would urge campaigners and in particular policymakers, if there are any policymakers that accidentally look at this, to one principle that I think we should adhere to is that we have to fix it for existing leases, right? I just want to emphasize this. We have to fix leasehold for existing leases. We have to make the system work for leases that already exist, which means that all the problems that I've talked about here, we have to fix it for existing leases. Because if we only fix it prospectively for leases tomorrow, for example, like we've done with ground rent, saying, oh, ground rent is a problem. What do? All leases signed as of this date, we're going to exempt them from ground rent. That's great. But it literally sells existing leases down the river, right? it's very, very important just to be completely cynical and clear about this. The fact that the government has done this ground rent reform means that existing long leases with ground rent, some of which are owners, are now completely duds. These properties will not sell, and the reason they will not sell and they will not be mortgaged is because of the ground rent. Because you now have a shiny new product out in the future with no ground rent, and then you have an old product here with a ground rent. Honestly, it is not difficult to see what's going to happen with these properties, right? And then again, it's going to be incumbent on us leaseholders, whose only mistake was to buy a lease before the cutoff day, to go and buy our ground rent. And as I said, please don't see this as me moaning and asking for a handout. I can take care of myself. I have a very good job, but again, for a lot of people, they don't. So I do think that it's important to emphasize this. So really, I think as we go through this, and when I think about myself and my role in this campaign, I'm going to be arguing 100% for fixing the problem for existing leases. If you fix the problem for existing leases, if you make conditions better for existing leases, and you know what, then we can talk about reforming, changing, abolishing leasehold. I don't really care how we get to that point, but it has to be existing leases, because if you fix it for existing leases, the new leases will follow naturally, right? Because if you create a good system for the existing leases, a reform that works for the leases that already exists. And here, when I talk about a system and change, I'm basically meaning we need leaseholders to get better control over the service charge, better control over the building, better control over their finances and their lives effectively. There has to be a shift in balance here. And of course, as far as ground rents are concerned, we have to get towards a cheaper way to buy out the ground rents and effectively enfranchise and perhaps also buy out the freehold. But we can talk about that another day. But effectively to get to that peppercorn rent, which the government has now admitted is the way it's supposed to be, well, that's fine. But then we need a route for existing leases to get to that point without too much pain, because otherwise, again, as I said, you're selling them down the river, right? So deep breath here at the end. If we fix it for existing leases, we fix it for new ones as well. If we fix it for new leases only, which is probably the political easy thing to do, we don't fix it for existing leases, and we actually sell existing leaseholders down the river. I think that would be a great shame. So I'll finish here, and for anyone watching, you remember I like to finish with two things that Winston Churchill said, which I think is apt for our little movement here. The first thing he said, which I'm sure some of you might know, is he said that when you're going through hell, keep going. That's what leaseholders have to do. I understand this is very difficult for a lot of leaseholders, and I understand that a lot of leaseholders at this point will probably be looking at the general system, and they'll probably be desperate and despairing and thinking, you know what, no one's going to help me. I can't guarantee anything, but I can tell you that those of us who are getting involved with this campaign, effectively to get leasehold in the sort of King's Speech and get some kind of reform on the table, we're going to work very hard that this is going to be for existing leases and not just new leases, as I've been explaining. And the final thing that Winston Churchill said, which I also think is apt here, is he said that success is going from failure to failure without the loss of enthusiasm. I think this is also a good metaphor for what it is to maybe even be a leaseholder, but certainly to try to change leasehold, because you do have a lot of stumbling blocks. It's the same stumbling blocks that turn up over and over again. But we'll keep fighting. I'll do more videos here in order maybe to specify and dig down into some of the more specific issues. But for now, I'll leave you with that. And thank you very much for watching. And come find me on Twitter, send me an email, drop a comment here on the YouTube video. Always happy to speak. I think the next 6 to 9 months are going to be really, really interesting here. And as you can hear, I'm losing my voice, so I'll stop talking now. But anyway, I'll see you around. Thank you very much.